Okay. Well, thank you folks for bearing with us here. We're going to now that we're streaming live on Facebook, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our next session of Gardening in the Panhandle Live. I'm happy to be back with you this week. Today we're going to be talking about soils and all of the facets that go along with that. We've got a real diversity of soils from the sands of Pensacola Beach to the west over to the Red Hill clay over in Mark's territory up near Bainbridge. So really a wide diversity, and so it's an interesting topic, and we appreciate you being with us today. Of course, I'm Daniel Leonard. I'll be your moderator today, but we've got an excellent panel for you here. This is a panel that we have not assembled yet before, so we're excited to see Dr. Pat Williams from Wakulla County, Mr. Ray Bodrey from Gulf County, and then some of our old favorites, Matt Lollar, Mark Tancig here. And behind the scenes, we've got Julie McConnell, our producer, and Matt Orwatt and Beth Bowles are helping us run the chats, the Q&As, and all of that good stuff. So with that, we'll get started. Hey folks, how are y'all doing today? That's our panelists. Y'all can talk.
Oh, good. We're doing great. I'm doing great.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
It's a 5-hour training this morning. I'm ready for more online stuff.
There you go. Awesome. So we're going to hop right into the topics here. We're going to start with Mark Tancig. And we're going to, for soils, you kind of have to start, any good extension agent has to start with soil testing. So Mark, our first Zoom listener has a question. How often is it recommended to do soil tests for nutrients before spring and fall planting? Once a year? What are your general recommendations?
All right. Well, our favorite answer in biology is it depends. So that's always a good answer for all sorts of questions. But with this particular one, it does kind of depend. So, if, what I would recommend, and I'll have the other folks kind of chime in here, but if you're really working on something, if you've done a soil, every time when you first move into a place, you should get a soil test and see where things are. If you are doing a lot of amending to try to bring that in line with whatever you're trying to grow, then I would suggest probably more frequent sampling, right? So say it says you need a lot of lime or a lot of sulfur, you may want to, the next season, do another test to kind of see how that amendments have changed the soil chemistry. But if not, if say your soil test comes back and everything looks pretty good, then maybe if it's lawn, maybe only every 3 years, 3 to 5 years, pull another soil sample to see if things are still kind of similar. If you're doing vegetables, then maybe once a year, you would do a soil test to kind of see where things are and if you need to amend anything. The one thing I did learn in my soils class is to try to keep everything, all the variables even. A good idea is to pull that soil sample at the same time of year each year when you go to test the soil. So, that way the weather is pretty similar, the microbes are acting pretty similar, and so hopefully your chemistry is a little bit more stable from test to test. That would be my recommendation. And
Gotcha.
I know we just put a chat in there about something in the chat about the soil sampling and testing through the University of Florida. It's a great, easy kind of process. It's only like $10 now. And the great thing is you get the report, we get the report. So if you don't understand what the report says, you can call us up and we will help translate what that means.
Yeah, it seems like some of those reports are written in Latin anyway. So
yeah.
But, it's not the easiest thing to interpret, so definitely reach out to your local extension agent. So that's awesome, Mark. So I got a quick question for you. So sometimes I'll get people that'll come in and be like, well, I put out some 1010 and I want to test my soil now. So you're talking like we should do our soil test before we make any amendments, correct?
Yeah, I get that question as well. Or I look at the results with someone and everything's high on the chart, off the charts, and they're like, well, I did fertilize, about a week before I took the test. And so you do want to make sure you do any of that. You do the soil test, the soil sampling for the test before adding any, major amendments, because that will throw off your results. So yeah, before you amend, get a test. and so you know what you actually need to add to the soil. And we have folks that they've heard from their neighbors, their grandparents, that you lime every year. And that's not always the case, folks. So, get a soil sample and see if it's something you need to add in the first place.
Yeah, that's awesome, Mark. Thank you. And so kind of within that, and talking about lime a little bit, Matt Lollar, let's focus on pH here for a minute. So you hear a lot about pH. A lot of people don't really know what pH is. So just quickly for us, what is pH and how important is it really?
I didn't know I had to say, well, what is pH? That
Well,
was
just
some long scientific discussion.
you don't have to get too deep into it.
No, sure. Basically, we're looking at how acidic or how basic your soil is. So we're ranging all the way from 0.1 to 14, acid the basic, and then right in the middle is 7. So that's going to be our neutral pH. As far as importance of pH, Mark just talked about soil sampling. That's probably the most important thing on your soil sample results. It's something that you could possibly adjust depending on what it is. And I think Ray is going to talk to you about lowering pH. So that's much more difficult than raising pH. But if you are able to adjust it or get it, slightly adjusted, it'll free up some of those nutrients that are already existing in the soil. And then it'll also allow for the plants to take up those nutrients, that fertilizer that you put out, as adequately as possible if you get that pH to the right spot. And it's going to depend on what you're growing. So if you've got a vegetable garden, you're looking at a range from 5.5 to 6.5, 7. And then depending on the turf grasses, we'll hit on those a little bit later. They could range. So Bahia turf is going to want something a lot lower than a St. Augustine grass lawn. But just to go back to the question, pH is very important. It's what makes those nutrients available. So we want to get it to the best spot possible, and taking those soil sample tests is going to help guide you as far as where you're going to get it.
There you go. Thank you, Matt.
Daniel, can I add something to that?
You sure can, Pat.
I think one of the things for people to realize is that pH isn't a permanent adjustment.
Okay.
If you're looking at something, you're trying to get your pH down to grow blueberries, if you're not constantly, adjusting for pH, it will return to back where it once was. So yeah, I'll always kind of go back to that landscaping thing, right plant, right place, but try to pick plants closer to your normal pH than adjusting. And if you're going to adjust, then put them into containers. It's easier to adjust in a container.
Yeah, our native soil is the way it is for a reason, and it's going to want to go back to that, isn't it?
Yep.
Gotcha. Okay. So, Mark, we've talked a little bit about soil testing and pH and the importance of pH and what it does a little bit. I get this from a lot of people. So they want to be able to test their own pH. They don't want to do a soil sample and send it off or whatever. They want to try to cheap out on them. Is there a pH meter that a person could buy and easily test their soil, should they want to do that?
Well, the straight answer is yes. There's all sorts of pH meters out there that you can go buy and you can stick in the soil and it'll spit something out as a result. But
so I can go buy the little $5 thing at Walmart with the
little pill.
Yeah.
You put this pill in the water. Yeah, you can. The problem is what is the accuracy of those little tests and the meters? Because the reason we recommend folks send it off to the soil lab in Gainesville is because they have the state-of-the-art equipment over there to make sure that you get a really good result, an accurate result. And the problem with those kits and those meters is they're not always, the meters aren't calibrated on a regular basis, right? So in the lab, when they're testing pH, the meters are probably daily or maybe a couple times a day calibrated to make sure they're, getting the right answer. And so, you can, but is the results you're getting accurate, and can you really trust it? That's what I'd say no. So I'd say just just get your sample, get you with your extension agent and send it off to Gainesville. And that's really the best way to get the best answer.
And I think the current pH the test is what, $3, $5? What?
I've been forgetting that now because I think it is 3, but it's 10 now for all of them. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
So it's only $3. So,
Yeah. If you just want your
probably
pH
cheaper
tested.
than the meter. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I know a lot of extension offices have a pH meter, and but I can also tell you that Mark is right. They don't get calibrated on a regular basis. The one that I have, it definitely doesn't. So pretty sure your most accurate reading is what Mark said. Go do the pH lab. So Mark, while we've got you here, we got a Facebook question that just came in. Generally, does Leon County have a slightly acidic soil or basic soil, or just kind of as what do you think?
Well, what's my favorite answer?
It depends.
It depends. It depends on where you're at. So in the, Leon County is really pretty unique in that we have this big Cody escarpment that kind of cuts about halfway through the county. So north of that, we have a lot more of those clays mixed in with our sands. And, up north, it's probably more slightly acidic. But if you go far south down towards Woodville area, and then you head down towards Pat's County and towards Wakulla and Crawfordville, you have limestone, really close to the surface, and there can be some really alkaline soils. And the story of constantly putting lime out every year. I had a fellow that couldn't grow bahia grass, and if we're usually trying to kill bahia grass in our lawns, right? So if something's going on if bahia grass doesn't grow, and he had been adding lime every year. We ran soil, I told him to get a soil test, and it came back super high because, again, he's got, he mentioned that makes sense because there's limestone pebbles in the soil, in the sand when I'm kind of prepping stuff. So it can depend. And so that's why the soil test is really the best thing to confirm, what you're dealing with.
Yeah, that's true. It depends. I hate that answer, but it's true.
It works all the time.
Yeah. So Ray, Mark has talked a bunch about people accidentally raising their pH with lime, and that's a common thing, but sometimes we do need to lower pH. And so can you do that?
You can. It's not probably a great result in the end, and something that you'll have to monitor and do almost every year. I get this question a fair amount. There's so many homes here in, say, the St. Joe area that were built on fill dirt, and a lot of this fill dirt that comes in is very alkaline, pH in the 8s, and it's really difficult to grow a vegetable garden on something like that. And even some of our native soils throughout Gulf County are that way. pH in the 7s really is, in my opinion, is not catastrophic for most plants, unless you're talking about
What if I want to grow blueberries?
yeah, blueberries and azaleas probably are not going to like that. But if you're up in the upper 7s or even into the 8s, that's really problematic. These strongly alkaline basic soils, like we were talking about just a minute ago, very difficult to correct, and it's nowhere near as easy to correct as you would with acidic soils and liming. And even that's a little laborious over time, depending on how acidic your soil is. There's some temporary adjustments that can be made with sulfur to bring the pH down. But like we're saying, like we're talking about here, the soil will eventually revert back to that native pH unless you just continuously, yearly add some sort of elemental sulfur or a sulfate compound like ammonia sulfate, iron sulfate. I think the recommendation, and there's an excellent EDIS publication called Soil pH and the Home Landscape and Garden, and there's some notation in there where I think the max is like 7 pounds per 1,000 square foot of lawn or garden space that control your alkaline pH. Now, when I talk to clientele, I kind of ease off of that a little bit. I generally give them a recommendation, depending on what they're doing and what they're planting, probably around 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Sulfur's really easy to burn a number of plants.
Yeah.
So really, if it's really sandy soils and the alkaline pH, compost, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later too, because I know I've got questions about that. But mushroom compost is a great amendment to use too, along with some sulfur compound. That's going to help retain some water. It's going to help build some microbial communities, really help soil health, and also in turn will help adjust some of that pH issue.
Gotcha. So organic matter and sulfur, a sulfur compound, if you're dead set on lowering that pH.
Right.
Yeah, and that's one that you're going to want to do soil sampling probably at least once a year or seasonally again to test.
I would say once a year. And a lot of times when I'm talking with clientele, I just say, there are a number of plants that like that alkaline pH. You maybe it's just better to relegate to planting those instead of making that a vegetable garden area.
Gotcha. Excellent. So kind of going along with some plants that Ray just suggested there, Matt Lollar, we just got one specific question on pH as far as plants go. And this client wants to know what pH do they need to be able to grow St. Augustine grass really well?
6.5.
There you go.
Done. No. Yeah, anywhere between 6 and 7 should be fine for St. Augustine. It's a little more tolerant of pH than maybe our Bahia would be. So
okay,
between 6 and 7, you'd be good.
Yeah. So just like your vegetable garden.
Yeah. St. Augustine has a lot more issues than just pH. So
yeah. Yeah. pH may be the least of your concerns with probably. Very good. So we're going to move on here a little bit. We've kind of brushed around amendments. And now just Pat, this is a real general question for you. But we have a Zoom listener that wants to know just in general, how should they amend their soil? Please don't give the Mark Tancig, it depends answer.
All right. Well, gosh, Mark stole my answer.
Yeah.
I always look at it this way. When I look at amending soils is what is my liability? So if I'm going to be planting trees or tall shrubs that have the ability to fall over, I don't. I plant in the native soil because I started out at a community college out in California where we basically blasted, holes out of rocks and put trees in, and they were all gone in 20 years because they blew over because they never rooted in. So here, when we look at it, if you look at a normal soil, you're shooting for about 5% organic matter. And so as you start trying to amend things, people always ask, how much do I put in? I just moved here in June from Sarasota County and started a new garden. And my goodness, my yard had sand in it. So knowing how far my roots are going to go down, if I'm looking at 5 inches of rooting or even 6 or 7, then 5% of that is adding a ½ inch. And
yeah,
whatever you put in, whether it be compost, I've got my compost pile, which is all plant material, or using well-aged manures and stuff like that. I think going back to what Mark said, just a little each year and then retest. When I was in Kentucky, we had a worm casting producer, and sales were really slow, and they ended up putting like 3 inches on their farm and tilling it in, and it ended up holding too much moisture and everything died.
Oh, wow.
One of the things with our sandy soils, they drain really well, but you start putting all the amendments in, and rainy season comes in summer, and you wonder why things aren't doing well because your soil is now holding a lot of extra moisture.
Okay.
One of the things I also do is I have a bagger on my lawnmower, so I mulch with grass clippings, just making sure I don't, touch anything. And then in between gardening seasons, I till that in a little bit, and that also helps with the till.
Gotcha. So there's a lot of ways to amend soil. This goes kind of along with the Facebook question that came in, or one of our Zoom listeners today. As far as adding organic matter goes, you talked about what you do, but you get this a lot. Can I put composted horse manure on the soil around my fruit trees, or should you dig it in? And that's where I want you to focus. So should you just lay the organic matter over the top of the soil and let it do its thing, or should you kind of till it in and help it along, in your opinion?
Whose question was that, mine?
Yeah, we'll just follow up on yours. Let you keep going here.
Tag, you're in.
you know, and truly to be an amendment versus a mulch on top of the surface, you've got to build it in. And one of the things about organic matter anyway is it fluffs the soil up. If you leave it on top, you will get the nutrients out of it. But most manures are in that 0.2, 0.3% for a nutrient anyway. So it's not like you're going to, you know, make your crop extra better. Manures and all those things are years and years of building up the soil. And if it's well aged, it won't really have an odor to it. But fruit trees really don't like a lot on top of the soil anyway. So I probably would not mulch anything on top of my root system.
Okay.
Tree.
Excellent. Ray, we're going to pivot back to a question that you talked about earlier about lowering pH. We had a follow-up to that. This is a common question too. So you get these acid-forming fertilizers like blueberry, azalea, camellia fertilizers. Can those change soil pH? What do you think?
Can they change soil pH?
Yeah, the fertilizers that are like for acid-loving plants, do they do anything to change pH, or is that just a specific formulation that those plants happen to like? Do you know?
I don't. It depends on if it's a really sandy soil. I would think it probably would change the pH. If there's some organics there is actually a microbial community there. And you've got some really good soil fertility going on, I think you probably wouldn't have much of a change just using fertilizer. But if it's a sandy mineral, just a really mineral soil, yeah, I think it would probably help change it.
I do know some of those, you know, those like azalea fertilizers, they sometimes have sulfur in them, or they're sulfur coated. So
Yeah.
that sulfur, it's not very much. So I don't know how much of a change you really get, but, you know, maybe by using them, you know, kind of spoon feeding it over time, you could help a little bit.
Yeah. Gotcha. So Mark, we're going to push on with soil amendments here in a second, but kind of following up on with the clay in your county a little bit. Listener Julie Dillard.
Oh, that name sounds familiar.
Yeah, I know. Friend of the program here, Julie Dillard. My area of the county is very different from the rest of Washington County with highly compacted clay soil. What would be a good specimen tree you might recommend in my front yard?
A specimen tree for clay soils. So I'm going to assume full sun.
Yeah, we're just gonna assume full sun here. Yeah.
You know, I kind of think of the native trees that can kind of handle it. So, you know, I'll go with, you know, you could do a live oak if you want a big, nice shade tree. You could try, say, a black gum. So Nyssa sylvatica, those are really pretty.
Those are.
Get good fall color, a nice architecture. You could try a maple tree even with some color. And I know that the Japanese maples, they do pretty well on our clay soils. But you could also try like a Japanese magnolia as well. So that's a really good specimen tree that seems to do well on our tight soils.
There you go, Julie. Mark's giving you a range of everything from the majestic giant live oak down to the diminutive Japanese maple. So
I'll add one too.
Yes, sir.
And that would be a winged elm.
Okay.
That's a really nice focal point, you know, kind of tree to put in a landscape. You're starting to see a lot of parks use that tree, and it has just a really interesting bark to it, and the way that it branches. It's just, take a look at that winged elm.
Okay, that's an excellent recommendation.
Have her contact her local extension agent.
Yeah, I don't know who that might be, Matt or what, but anyway, thank you, Julie, for the question. So Mark, we're going to stay with you. Excuse me, we're going to go to Ray, who just added on there. Ray, tell us a little bit about mushroom compost. That's probably the most, next to like just bag soil you can buy at a store. Mushroom compost is probably the most common, popular garden amendment. So tell us a little bit about mushroom compost.
And I use it religiously. I just about have to where I am in Port St. Joe, with anything from using it in landscaping or fruit trees, raised beds, you name it. I've got to use some mushroom compost with my native soils around here. It's generally a mix of cow, poultry manure, cotton seed, even some gin trash you can find in some of that, straw. There's various components to it. It's pretty easy to find in smaller bags at your garden centers and your box chains and places like that. If you're like me and you need a truckload of it, it's a little more difficult to find. But there's some really good vendors out there. I know we have one here in northern Gulf County. I think Pat may have one over in McCullough, close to Crawfordville, if that business is still there. We used to have, and Mark maybe can talk more to this too. We used to have a large company, and I think it was Leon County that produced.
They're in Quincy.
Was it Quincy? And I think they are no longer in business. What we're getting here in Gulf County is from a company out of Dothan.
Okay.
But it's really good stuff. I can tell you it's just as good as what we had before. It seems like the same sort of recipe. Again, it's great to use, adding a little bit of organic nutrient to your soil. Again, it's great for water holding capacity in sandy soils too.
For sure. And it's not composted mushrooms. It's mushroom compost.
Correct.
Yeah.
It would be a great media to grow mushrooms in.
This is true. There you go.
I want to add something with the mushroom compost, because I do get a lot of, I'll get soil test results that come in where they sampled the compost basically out of the raised bed. And I do think that something happens in the process, right? Because compost is not soil, right? It's organic matter. It's not
Right.
Sand, silt, and clay particles. So the results that have come back when folks have kind of just sent off some compost, the pH is a little bit wonky, and sometimes it's in the upper 7 sometimes. And I think compost naturally tests, a little bit alkaline, but like Ray said, it is very helpful because it helps your soil, it just builds the health of the soil. So I wouldn't worry too much about that pH. But another thing we had weird, and I love to hear what you guys think, is we had copper levels come in really high with this particular batch of mushroom compost. And I did find some information where poultry litter, I think especially, if the chickens have been, fed a fungicide, there could be high levels of poultry in random batches of that huge truckload of manure that gets dropped off. So I like to tell folks to, just like our diet, our FCS agents, they tell us, eat a variety of fruits and vegetables. So I like to tell folks too, to every now and again, switch up your compost, mushroom compost. Maybe you get a different blend another time, just to kind of mix it up a little bit.
That makes sense. Yeah. Compost can have some wonky things in it.
Yeah, the other thing I'd warn against with chicken litter is that a lot of times it's really high in zinc. So
Okay. Weird.
Did have a farmer that grew daylilies, and to get some of the zinc out of the soil, he grew corn in different patches on the farm, because corn loves zinc, so it'll pull it out. As long as you don't use it as a cover crop and then till it back in.
There you have. We're gonna get the cover crops here in a minute. So, but good deal. So yeah, that's interesting. Mark, kind of piggybacking off of mushroom compost as an amendment. It might be your answer may be mushroom compost, but in your opinion, and I know you do a lot of work with the veg heads out back in the garden there at Leon County. What is the best way to enrich garden soil?
Compost, organic matter.
There you go.
No depends there. Just keep adding organic matter. That's the best thing you can do.
And it doesn't really matter what it is, does it?
I mean, no, as long as it's clean in some way,
Yeah.
it's not got a bunch of weeds or anything in it. But like
Right.
Pat said, the ideal, amount of organic matter in your soil is about 5%, and that's doing really well. In Florida, we're lucky if we can get, maybe up to 2 with our hot sands. So the best way is to enrich it with addition of organic matter. So you can add compost, you put mulch on top of your plants, and that as that mulch breaks down, it's adding to the organic component of your soil. So I think, compost.
Okay. And while we're talking about compost, how much compost or manure per acre needs to be added to the sand or the soil to grow vegetables? And this is obviously for, a gardener or a small farmer.
And this is why I'm glad we get these questions ahead of time, because I had to bust out the calculator. In general, it's recommended to try to get about 1 to 2 inches. I think Pat mentioned that as well, about 1 to 2 inches of organic matter, that you would put out and then incorporate into the soil. That works out to about 6 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. You don't really want to go above that. And then I wrote some notes down over here. For an acre, where'd it go here? For an acre, if you did 2 inches of organic amendment on that acre, you would need about 135 cubic yards of compost.
Wow.
So you need quite a bit. Now, if you go down, no, you need 270. I'm sorry, 2 inches is 270 cubic yards. 1 inch over that acre is 135 cubic yards. So you need quite a bit, and then you need to till that in. So they don't recommend, and this is maybe in more landscape situations, not to go over that 6 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet, because again, it is organic matter and it will decompose. So if you put too much in your soil, you could potentially have the problem Pat mentioned of not enough drainage potentially, or as it decomposes, you'll get some, it won't be level ground on like a lawn setting or something like that.
Yeah. And just like Matt said earlier, be careful when you're adding that raw compost out. You don't necessarily know what is in it. And if you don't let it compost down a little bit, it can burn some stuff up too. So if you try to plant right into it. But yeah. So Mark, you said like between 100 and 300
yards between
per acre?
35 to 270 cubic yards per acre.
Okay. There's your range, folks.
A big truck is about what is the big one? Like 40 cubic yards is some of the dumps we get here of mulch.
Yeah.
So, that's several of them per acre. The other thing is when they drop it off and it's hot, you want to let that sit. If you get compost and it's steaming, you want to let that stuff sit for a while before you use it, because that'll burn your plants.
For sure. All right, Mark, we've leaned on you pretty hard here during the compost.
Right, I'm taking a break.
Take a little break. So, all right, Pat, we're going back to Wakulla County here, folks. For Pat, do we need to add Epsom salts every year? I hear, some of the old timey gardeners, add Epsom salts every year. Is that necessary?
Well, I think one of the first things to do is, we go back to the soil test, what's in the soil, and then you got to look at your fertilizers. Epsom salt is basically just magnesium and sulfate. Both of those are secondary nutrients, so the plants do need them in larger amounts, but most of your fertilizers are also applying those. One of the things that was new to me in Florida is that your fertilizers have to be registered here, and there should be an F serial number on your bag when you're putting those out. And that means most of your nutrients are slow release. The thing about the Epsom salts, both the magnesium and the sulfates are soluble salts, and so their long-term survivability in the soil will go wherever the water goes. And also a lot of times, especially if you're getting that, same grade you're soaking your feed in, there's no application rates to know how much to put in your garden.
Yeah.
You're more likely you put a little too much in, and excessive salts aren't good. Overall, I don't recommend Epsom salts. I would say look at your fertilizers that's been formulated for your plants in a nice slow release fashion.
Yeah, Epsom salts tend to be more useful in a large fertigation type setting on a commercial vegetable farm where they can, dissolve it and inject it through their irrigation system. So unless you're in that situation, like Pat said, maybe a good idea to stay away from Epsom salts. Thanks, Pat. So another question for you here related to this, putting products out. Do we need to add a boom blaster to improve flowering on our plants? That sounds pretty cool. Not exactly sure what that is.
I think a lot of times, fertilizer companies and all these other companies are set up to make money.
Yeah.
And people are, well, what's that? One born every moment.
Yeah.
So
you're not going to pull out your bloom blaster?
No, it's nothing that does that. Depending on true bloom blasters, they'll just be higher in phosphorus, which is that middle number on the fertilizer bag. The Florida soils tend to be high in phosphorus anyway because of our limestone underneath. And where we just came from down south, we recommend no or phosphorus to 2%. And it's different if you're doing a vegetable garden and you're trying to get fruit. That's what that phosphorus is for. That's what the bloom is for. If you're doing, like right now, you're doing a lot of fall vegetables, a lot of green things, you don't need that extra phosphorus. So there again, kind of beware of all the shiny labels and everything. Flowers will come.
Okay.
The root system and shoots first.
That makes sense. So don't necessarily fall for those marketing claims, and don't pull out your bloom blaster in the garden. It's not necessary, maybe. So Pat, another fertilizer question. So this client's palm leaves are always yellow, and we know you've been down in Sarasota. There's a few palms in South Florida, so you should be familiar with this. So how can you correct yellow palm leaves, and what's going on there?
That would seem like an easy question, but very, very complex.
Okay.
I don't know. Yeah, they have put in the chat a really good diagnostic site that you can all go to out there, and it will run through the different scenarios. And it really makes a difference whether it's yellow on the top of the palm, on the lower fronds, shade levels, light levels. If it's yellow with a little bit of green in it, it could be magnesium. There's also lethal yellowing, which is a disease. So I really can't say, a picture's worth 1,000 words here. We just have the word yellowing. And
Yeah.
I would be cautious about recommending anything sight
I hear
unseen.
you. Unfortunately, we need a little bit more information from this client. Whatever county you're in, reach out to your local UFIFAS extension agent, and they would definitely be happy to help you how to fix that yellowing problem by diagnosing what's wrong with it first. So good call there. Thanks, Pat. Matt Lollar, we're coming back to you after an extended break there. So you need
Oh, I know, that was relaxing.
Yeah. So Matt, is it true that I should fertilize vegetables and fruit trees twice as often in sandy soil? So essentially just more frequent. Do sandy soils require more frequent fertilizer since there's less nutrients there?
I mean, I would say it just depends on the product that you're using. I mean, if it's in the fruit trees and vegetables are going to be different. So with a lot of our fruit tree fertilizers, they're going to be slow release products. So they'll either be either sulfur coated prills, or they'll be like a plastic type substance that breaks down coated prills. And something like that, I would just follow the recommendations from the manufacturer. They're going to give you a guide, and usually even with those slow release fruit tree fertilizers, they're going to say, based on the diameter of the trunk, the age of the tree, you'll either fertilize it this much 3 times a year, or a little bit larger amount 2 times a year if it's an older tree and it can take up more of those nutrients. With the vegetables, it might not be twice as frequent, but it is going to be more frequent in your sandy soil, because with vegetables, we're generally going to recommend a readily available fertilizer, because those plants need it, much more often than a fruit tree that's just developing that fruit. It's a perennial crop, so it has a whole year to work on that fruit. So in a sandy soil, ideally, you would want a drip irrigation system that you could run fertilizer through and just feed it with a liquid fertilizer. If you don't have that ability, or if you're cheap like me, then you'd want to, let's say you're starting with transplants, and you would put out some of your fertilizer. So if it's in a sandy soil, it might be a quarter of your yearly recommended rate at planting. And then, a couple times, let's say when the plant gets to be, a foot tall, then you might give it some more. And then right before it blooms, you want to give it a little bit more.
So we do that just because the sand is not going to hold it all?
Yeah, the sand's not going to be able to hold it for long enough for it to be available. Now, I know that is one thing that UF is looking at, especially at our Live Oak Research Center. So that's part of the North Florida Research and Education Center.
Yeah.
They're looking at fertilizing with slow release products in vegetables. So hopefully in years to come, we'll have some slow release product information, and that'll be very helpful for the home gardener as well as fruit and vegetable farms. They'll be able to fertilize and not have to think about it as much.
For sure. All right, that's awesome. So we've run through some soil testing, pH, some amendments and fertilizers, and now we're going to kind of get to the fun part of the program, just some random miscellaneous type questions. So Ray, we're coming back to you in Port St. Joe. Any suggestions for a slope where rain washes away the topsoil from the grass, leaving vacant spots with no grass? So it sounds like we've got an erosion problem going on. What are we going to do about it?
Sounds like an erosion problem, definitely. Well, you know, I'm trying to kind of imagine the situation too a little bit. If the grass is, you know, already growing in areas of the slope and then not in some areas, I would imagine, you know, you may have some spots there where there's a compaction issue going on, where the grass roots or even weeds never really have a chance to take hold. And then once you get get some precipitation, then, you know, that area just erodes away. If that's the case, I mean, there's options of where you could till those areas to alleviate the compaction issue and put some sod in the early spring, kind of do all this in the early spring. That may help. Or, you know, even, I mean, if the slope is just really too steep, you may even run into issues with that approach. You know, it may be a scenario where you've got a slope that really a lawn may not be the best choice in that area. Okay,
It happens.
it happens. I've got spots like that around my home. You may want to think about maybe mulching the area instead and putting, you know, do some landscaping through there with some native plants. And then, you know, I'm kind of imagining this at the steepness of the grade and everything. And if it's in that way, you could also, you know, put a rain garden down at the very end of the slope with some, you know, really water loving plants and to catch any of this excess rainwater. That's a solution too. And if you think about it this way, in the end, that's going to be less work on you because that's less lawn to mow, and it's not a lot of upkeep compared to a lawn. UF has an excellent Florida-friendly landscaping guide. It's the plant selection and landscape guide. And what I really love about it has actually a page dedicated to rain gardens, kind of a schematic, a how-to. And I think there's some excellent schematics in there anyway about how to make some beds on properties. And the best part about it too is that the plant selection guide, where you have tons of pictures, and it's broken down nicely into, you know, trees, small trees, shrubs, ground covers, grasses. So that would give somebody an excellent you know, resource to start kind of putting a plan together. But yeah, it may be a situation where really in the long run, mulching that area and, you know, kind of having a little bit of a wildscape through there may be the best course of action.
Yeah. You got options, folks. There you go. Straight from Ray Bodrey in Port St. Joe. There you go. That's awesome. Matt Lollar, I assume this next person's talking about cover crops. Their question is, what's the best crop cover to grow now for gardens? And we're just going to assume they're talking about cover crops.
Okay, so we'll post a document with some different options. You know, I would wait maybe a couple more weeks to plan on planting a fall cover crop, just to allow the soil temperature to drop a little bit more. Usually we look into nighttime temperatures, outside temperatures of 50 in the 50s.
Yeah.
And you could go with something like either a perennial ryegrass or grain rye. You could go with some different oats, and UF's done all sorts of research on a bunch of different oats, but you could just get something basic that whatever you can find. And then the other thing, so those would add some organic matter. They're probably not going to add much as far as nutrients, except for over time. Your other option would be crimson clover, and that'll add some nitrogen to the soil. And probably your best bet would be a mixture of crimson clover and any of those grasses. That way the grasses take up the nitrogen. Then when you till the grasses in with the clover, they breaks down, and that nitrogen is available to the plants in your garden. So.
Excellent. Yeah. So you got some cover. I can't say that. This can be a hard thing to say. Cover crops.
Yeah, and I mean that's more planning ahead for the spring garden.
Yeah.
If you do have rows in your garden, you could plant that clover, or maybe just the ryegrass in the row middles, and then that allows for a weed barrier and then also some nutrients as the plants grow.
Very good. Awesome. Mark Tancig, we get these infestations sometimes. So what happens if you get a millipede infestation? Is that a problem with your soil, or is that a sod or a grass issue going on?
It's just a nuisance. Just sweep them off the place.
Just random?
Yeah, it's just, I think sometimes after rain events and just certain times of the year, you'll get a bunch of them to show up. I see Matt Lollar shaking his head. You just had a big rain event. Did you get attacked by millipedes or ants?
Not yet, but I live in the woods and I got a covered porch, and the millipedes love it. So, millipedes.
Millipedes are insect predators, so they're eating other insects. So they're not really damaging your sod, or they're not harmful to the soil. And so there's a link there that's got some really great information on everything you'd want to know about centipedes, millipedes, pill bugs, and sow bugs and earwigs.
All kinds of good little creepy crawlies there.
And these are all good things. Some of these are eating other insects that could be pests, and some of them are also chewing organic matter that's kind of in big chunks, and so they're breaking it down so that becomes more readily available to your crop. So they're often helping out.
Yeah, awesome. And so kind of related to all of the creepy crawly things, the next client wants to know, should I add worms to my soil? And if so, what kind would you recommend?
I would say no.
No.
If you have good healthy soils, you're probably going to have some worms in there already, some earthworms. And so the deal with worms, and I couldn't find a research-based document for you, but all the sites I saw that were promoting worms to throw in your garden were the ones selling worms. So
not the greatest generally.
Yeah, so you got to be careful with their recommendations, right? But here's the thing:
if they're selling bloom buster or booster at the same time,
yeah, right.
Booster.
Yeah.
So earthworms go up and down, and they are good for your soil because they aerate the soil, and they're pooping and eating stuff, and that's fertilizing your plants. But the red wigglers and some of these other ones that we use for composting, they move kind of side to side in the soil layer, in the soil horizon. The thing is, if you throw them in your garden, that's really not the best habitat for those horizontal worm dwellers. I don't know what the right word is there, but
we get it.
Yeah, they're not going to stick around for too long. So I would say if you want to play with worms, have them in a vermicompost system. So compost separately in a closed container with these red wiggler worms, and then use their castings to amend the soil. You'd be getting better use of those worms if you did that instead of just throwing the worms in the garden.
Okay. Yeah. So it's my experience that if we're doing what you guys have told us to do, and adding our organic matter and taking care of our soil, the worm, you build it, they will come type thing.
That's right. The worms will just be there.
Yeah. It's crazy. So Matt Lollar, we kind of already talked about this with Julie Dillard's question. I don't know if you had any other options you wanted to talk about as far as planting trees and shrubs in a red clay area. Maybe instead of the plants, just what are some practices that may help those plants survive?
Yeah, that's the way I kind of read that question. As far as Julie Dillard's question, I think my favorite would have been the saucer magnolia, so the Japanese magnolia, or star magnolia. As far as planting the trees in a clay soil, the wider the hole that you can dig, the better, because you want to break up as much of that clod as possible. I would definitely not recommend putting a different soil type in that hole. You want to amend back with the native soil that you dig out to plant that tree. If you for some reason, if you're up against close to a house or somewhere where you can't dig that hole as wide as you'd like, I mean, generally we'd say at least 2 times the width of the root
Right.
ball. But if you're unable to do that, and still if you are, once you have that hole dug, go in with the shovel and just kind of cut into the side walls of that hole, and that'll help you. That'll help those roots get into that soil a little bit better.
Okay.
And definitely don't plant the tree too deep. So
Might need to bust
great
out
as
the
far as
mattock.
what it is in the pot.
Yeah. What was that, Mark?
Might need to bust out the mattock. I've dug in some clay holes over here where it's no fun. And wait after a rain. You do it after if it's dry, you're gonna be cursing trying to dig that hole.
Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, we had cows, and we would have to build fence from time to time. And you'd encounter a clay pocket in a field, and it would try to dig the post hole, and be like, "Oh my goodness!"
Just bounce.
Yeah, let's skip this part. So, anyway, kind of related to that, Mark. How does a homeowner function when the yard, the sod has take all root rot, and we're taking red clay? So, what would be your recommendation there?
So take out root rot. You're on clay. I'd ask a bunch of questions on how you're taking care of that lawn the whole year. So, what is your watering like? What is your mowing like? What is your fertilization like? Because, if you're doing those not quite right, that can just make it worse. Then to try to make things better, you can try to improve the situation as far as the clay. It's all about compost. So try to, they're actually doing some amazing research out at the villages. UF is working with the villages and looking at incorporating compost into residential lawns. And they're getting a lot of improvement in, the way the lawn looks due to nutrients, but they're also finding that it's helping break up and kind of, help the structure of that soil as well. So you can't put a whole bunch of compost over your existing lawn. So just try to kind of feather it in there and just keep adding organic matter, recycle those leaves or those clippings back into the lawn, and just general care of the grass all year long.
Gotcha. Thanks, Mark. So that's a tough problem sometimes, that take all root rot, and that's some tips to help you there. Ray, we've been talking about clay here for a couple minutes, but much more common in the Panhandle are sandy soils. And just quickly give us a couple of maybe your favorite plants, landscape plants for sandy soils like you might encounter in St. Joe.
Sure. Well, if you're looking for something that's full sun, virtually maintenance free, anything in the succulent or cacti category will work. Some people don't like that sort of look. Makes an excellent it looks good in landscape, in my opinion. It makes a excellent break-in deterrent underneath your windows in your landscape beds. I noticed that on a trip out to New Mexico a while back. Really, a lot of your native plants, a lot of your pollinator friendly to native plants like milkweeds, iris. Yeah, exactly. Black-eyed Susan, any of the butterfly weed. Stokes aster is one of my favorites. As far as like plants that you would, let's see, have in the shady areas, probably that would like sandy soils, that would thrive in sandy soils, something like lower growing plants like hostas, daylilies, things like that. Another plug on the Florida Friendly Landscaping Plant Selector and Landscape Guide. Within the Plant Selector Guide, there's you can go through and see the characteristics of each plants that are on display in there. And there's a soil texture category that'll tell you whether or not it's one that you would want to grow in a clay soil or a sandy soil. So that's another good reference to check out.
Yeah, I mean, Ray is totally right. If you could only have one reference book, it would be that Florida Friendly Landscape Plant Design Selection book. I don't know exactly what the name is, but you get my drift. Best book you can have. I use it all the time.
Right here.
No doubt.
Yeah,
no
there
doubt.
it is. There it is. Got a couple of questions left here, but before we hit those, I just want to say we're doing like a double feature this next week. So next week on October the 1st is our next Gardening in the Panhandle live event, and we're going to be talking exclusively about planting trees and shrubs. So everything you ever wanted to know on planting, how to get plants established and survive. And again, that's going to be next week, October the 1st. And the 1st is next Thursday. So next Thursday, right back here for that. And before you leave today, check out our survey in the chat. Even if you filled it out before on previous events, we'd appreciate you filling it out today for us. That would greatly help us. And so we'll finish up here with these last couple of questions. Thank you for that. Mark Tancig, see your smiling face right there. What is the effect of saltwater flooding on our soils? Not that you have to deal with that in Leon County.
That'd be a bad storm.
That would be a really bad hurricane if Tallahassee gets flooded.
I wouldn't be here if that were the case.
Yeah,
you
Pat
can
would be under about 20 feet of water if it gets to Tallahassee.
Um,
What
so-
should you do to minimize that effect, Mark?
Well, it's obviously not good, right? So you don't put salt water on your plants, unless it's seagrass or, something like that. So unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you're going to be able to do immediately. So this is one of those where dilution is the only thing that's going to kind of wash those salts away over time. So when we get rain, I mean, you could water it, but I don't want you to waterlog your soils or waste a bunch of water because it's going to take quite a bit.
Yeah.
So it's kind of just a wait until that stuff is, that those salts are kind of diluted out of there. If you live in a coastal area where this could happen regularly, you want to, that right plant, right place idea, you want to pick plants that are adapted to, an occasional, blast of salt water. So, it's a matter of, somewhat picking the right plant for the right place. But I think, like Mary Salinas, another one of our agents, she just had like 10 feet of, salty water onto her property. So, there's not a whole lot you can do. If you got some really prized thing that you want to save, I mean, I guess you could like dig it out and like wash all the soil off of it and try to plant it in some new soil, but it may not live the shock of all that. So,
Yeah, I agree. Best thing you could probably do is just go to like a natural beach area and just see what grows there.
yeah, get some
I
ideas.
grow a bunch of celery.
Yeah.
Celery.
You can handle it.
There you go.
There was a question I saw that popped up about, fertilizer use by the springs. And
Yeah, we're just fixing to get to that one.
Okay. Yeah. Anyone else can take it. Let's go for it.
Now I'm gonna, since you and Pat are over there on top of that B map with Wakulla Springs, I'm gonna let you handle it. It's from Jill Arnsdorf. She has property located on Econfina Springs. A nice spring area there in Bay County, Washington County. Are there any special precautions she should use in applying fertilizer in light of that clean spring water?
I mean, I think you want to, if you're right on the spring run or the river, you definitely want to leave a buffer where you do no fertilizing whatsoever.
Okay.
At least, 10 feet is what we recommend, but if you got the room, give it another 20 or 30. But if you are using fertilizer and you're close by, I know Pat kind of mentioned this, but you want to put the right amount out. Get a soil test, see what you need to put out, and then put it out at the right rate so that you can make sure that the plants are picking up that fertilizer instead of it, running off or leaching down towards the water table. So, that would be my recommendation.
Pat, you got anything to add being right there on Wakulla Springs?
And around Wakulla Springs, if you go around the roads, they'll sit there and say, please don't fertilize at all.
Okay.
Because all the water in Florida kind of flows under the ground and gets to it at some point in time. So if you can change your plant palette in the yard to be more native things like that versus high maintenance lawns, that would be the track I would go.
Gotcha. Minimize that fertilizer use through any means possible. Good job, guys. And our last question here, and I'll just kind of pose this to the group and get y'all's thoughts. Can you grow veggies using cuttings? So you got some enterprising folks here growing a vegetable garden on the cheap, maybe. Can you grow veggies using cuttings? And can you do that in regular fertilized garden soil? Or so y'all just talk about propagation on these veggie plants real quick before we get out of here.
I mean, if you have a facility where you can propagate, I mean, it just depends on the veggie, but I know greenhouse tomato farmers, that's how they grow some of their transplants. They can start them from cuttings.
Yeah.
You can definitely grow sweet potatoes from cuttings.
Yeah. But you don't want to, you want to start those in kind of a little propagation type area with potting soil.
Yeah, you'd want a
Straight in the
propagation
garden.
mix in little cells, and you really care for those plants.
Yeah, my thought on that is that, you know, a lot of vegetables are annual crops. So, you know, they don't tend to lend themselves too well to starting from cuttings. I mean, I guess some things, if you can protect them and you got a long enough growing season where you can take cuttings and then grow them out to fruit. Otherwise, annuals, you know, the best thing to do is, you know, start from seed. Gotcha.
So Mark says start from seed. Matt says if you've got some space where you can overwinter them, cut away.
And if it is a tomato, I will say it is illegal to propagate some of those named varieties. So
yeah,
be careful there too.
Yep. So patented and those named, especially a lot of those F1 hybrids. If you bought an F1 hybrid, probably, you know, you just want to go ahead and buy the seed, prevent any legal issues on that in case you decide to sell your transplants. So yeah, I appreciate everybody for tuning in today. That's going to conclude the program. Thank you so much. Got Pat, Ray, Mark, Julie Beth, and Matt. That was a fun day. I appreciate it. We learned a lot about soil testing, pH, amendments, fertilizing, and then just random questions. And we appreciate everybody for tuning in on Zoom and Facebook. Any parting shots for the day, gentlemen?
Compost, compost, compost.
Hey, Daniel, this
Yes,
is
sir.
Orwatt here. Just a quick little tidbit that those F1 hybrids will not breed true from seed if you save those seeds. So you need to buy the seed from the supplier.
Parting shot for Matt Orwatt there, folks.
Thank you, Mr. Orwatt.
He always lends a smart comment there. So appreciate that. Thank you guys for tuning in today. It depends, and we will see you next Thursday for planting trees and shrubs. Thank you guys. Y'all have a good afternoon. See you.
Bye, everyone.